Hey, welcome to Genre Chat Podcast for SeriousWriter.com. I'm Caleb Walton, and this is part two in our series Back to Basics. We're getting deep into NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month in November, and I know I'm writing away trying to get my manuscript finished by the end of the month, as are countless of other writers across the country. So make sure to leave a comment below and let us know how NaNoWriMo is working out for you and what the different techniques you're doing to achieve your goals and keep from procrastinating, which is something that I have to watch out for, especially when I have a deadline to hit. Last week we took a look at science fiction and thriller suspense novels and really dug deep into the different subgenres there. This week we'll be looking at fantasy and romance, and then we'll look at a couple of different ways to figure out which genre is right for you and your story. But before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the Serious Writer YouTube channel and go to SeriousWriter.com to check out the Serious Writer Academy and the other podcasts that are available. So fantasy is one of the most popular genres of fiction, one of my personal favorites. You get anything from the Game of Thrones, the Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, all of these great franchises fall under the fantasy genre. So we're going to start off with urban fantasy. Urban fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy in which the story has well-defined magical rules or elements operating in an urban setting. This is a very popular genre. Next, we have high fantasy. High fantasy is defined by either the epic nature of its setting or by the epic nature of its characters, themes, or plot. A good example of this is the Game of Thrones or the Lord of the Rings. Dark fantasy is a subgenre that incorporates darker or frightening themes of fantasy. It also often combines fantasy with elements of horror and sometimes has a gloomy, darker tone and a sense of horror or dread. A lot of times, dark fantasy will deal with dark magic or dark sorcery. Now, horror is kind of a difficult one to place. This could have gone in either science fiction or fantasy, but simply because this is where it seemed to fit the best in context, I decided to sort of file it under the fantasy category. But horror can really incorporate elements of science fiction, fantasy, romance, several different elements. So horror is basically defined as a story intended to frighten, scare, or startle its readers by inducing feelings of horror or dread. Basically, anything by Stephen King could qualify as horror. Contemporary fantasy obviously is a fantasy novel set in the present day. A good example of this would be Harry Potter. Something that I often see in contemporary fantasy stories is that if it is set in this world as opposed to like a parallel universe where magic is considered the norm, a lot of times the authors will come up with creative ways to sort of hide their fantasy world from everyone else and to sort of give an explanation of why we don't see magic on a regular basis. J.K. Rowling especially does a very good job of sort of enriching the world with the sort of secret society of wizards and witches. So the first example we're going to give is for urban fantasy. A Blade So Black by L.L. McKinney is a great example of this. It's sort of a modern day take on Alice in Wonderland, and we'll just take a quick look at the summary. The first time the nightmares came, it nearly cost Alice her life. Now she's trained to battle monstrous creatures in the dark dream realm known as Wonderland, with magical weapons and hardcore fighting skills. Yet even warriors have a curfew. Life in real-world Atlanta isn't always so simple, as Alice juggles the overprotective mom, a high-maintenance best friend, and a slipping GPA. Keeping the nightmares at bay is turning into a full-time job, but when Alice's handsome and mysterious mentor is poisoned, she has to find the antidote by venturing deeper into Wonderland than she's ever gone before. And she'll need to use everything she's learned in both worlds to keep from losing her head. Now, this is a really good example of urban fantasy. As you see, it takes place in modern day Atlanta and also dips into the mystical world of Wonderland. So it's a good example of a fantasy set in an urban setting with well-defined magical rules and laws. George R. R. Martin's The Game of Thrones is the perfect example of high fantasy. It's really good, well defined by, like I say, a sweeping cast of characters, witches, wizards, dragons, and a really well defined world that the author has made. So it has a culture, it has a sweeping setting, landscapes, a lot of different elements there. So it's a really good example of high fantasy. Another good example of this would be The Lord of the Rings or even the Chronicles of Narnia. Shadow and Bone is a really good example of dark fantasy. Just looking over the summary, it's easy to tell that it incorporates a lot of elements of dark magic and dark sorcery that the characters are trying to fight against, which is really, a really good hallmark of the dark fantasy subgenre. This is a really good example, so I'm just going to read over the summary real quick. Soldier, summoner, and saint, orphaned and expendable, Alina Starkov is a soldier who knows she may not survive her first trek across the Shadowfold, a swath of unnatural darkness scrawling with monsters. But when her regiment is attacked, Alina unleashes dormant magic that not even she knew she possessed. Now Alina will enter a lavish world of royalty and intrigue as she trains with the Grisha, her country's magical military elite, and falls under the spell of their notorious leader, the Darkling. He believes Alina can summon a force capable of destroying the Shadowfold and reuniting their war-ravaged country, but only if she can master her untamed gift. As the threat to the kingdom mounts and Alina unlocks the secrets of her past, she will make a dangerous discovery that could threaten all she loves and the very future of a nation. It's easy to tell this incorporates a lot of elements of dark magic and dark sorcery, a lot of creatures and monsters, all of which are really good signs of a dark fantasy novel. Now, horror is a really broad genre, and I wanted to pick something that was very, very creepy and unsettling, but yet not especially gruesome. Just because I want to make sure I don't ever put anything that's going to make anyone uncomfortable in the show. But this is a really good example of this. Melanie Golding's Little Darlings, and I think this is actually about to be adapted into a movie. So just to look at the summary of this. Everyone says that Lauren is exhausted, that she needs rest, and they're right. With newborn twins, Morgan and Riley, she's never been more tired in her life. But she knows what she saw that night in her hospital room. A woman tried to take her babies and replace them with her own creatures. Yet, when the police arrived, they saw no one. Everyone from her doctor to her husband thinks she's imagining things. A month passes, and one bright summer morning, the babies disappear from Lauren's side in a park. But when they're found, something is different about them. The infants look like Morgan and Riley to everyone else, but to Lauren, something is off. As everyone around her celebrates their return, Lauren begins to scream, "These are not my babies." Determined to bring her true infant sons home, Lauren will risk the unthinkable. But if she's wrong about what she saw, she'll be making the biggest mistake of her life. Compulsive, creepy, and inspired by some of our darkest fairy tales, Little Darlings will have you checking and rechecking your own little ones just to be sure, just to be safe. This is a really good example of horror. Like I said, it's not too gruesome, but it's very unsettling and will definitely have you looking out of the corner of your eye. And of course, Harry Potter, the Harry Potter franchise, is a really good example of modern fantasy that takes place in a contemporary setting, but with a lot of magical elements. And like I said earlier, J.K. Rowling does a really good job of sort of incorporating into the wizarding world some logical explanations for the reader of why, if the book is supposedly set in the modern day, no one ever knows or hears about magic or wizarding. So she does a really good creative job of sort of hiding that from everyone else. Now, romance is another really great genre of fiction. Female readers make up, I believe, the majority of readers in the US, according to a survey I recently read. And romance is definitely a popular genre with that in mind. Contemporary romance obviously is going to be a romance set in modern times. It's very funny because even if you look at Jane Austen and books like that, in their day, those were contemporary romances, but of course, we almost consider those Regency or historical romance now. But anything that's set in modern day could be classified as contemporary romance. Romantic suspense, it's a really good genre to get into now if that is your passion, just because it's in very high demand in today's literary market. Historical romance takes place in the past. Like I said, things like Jane Austen would probably qualify as historical romance now, even though they were contemporary when they were first written. But historical romance is basically any romantic story that takes place in the past. So anything from World War I, World War II, to medieval times, to the Civil War, anything that takes place in a historical setting. Regency and Gothic are two very popular genres. They're similar, they can be blended together, but they're also separate depending on what you're looking at. Some would even say Jane Austen qualifies as Regency romance. It all depends on what time period it takes place in. So Regency typically takes place during the time period of England where the regent was ruling the nation. And there's a lot of details historically there that I'm not too familiar with, but it's all about that time period and sort of the spirit in Great Britain at the time. Whereas Gothic romance, it usually involves supernatural elements with sort of hints of horror. It's usually set against very dark backgrounds, often featuring like medieval ruins and castles. Gothic romance, there's a lot there if you want to do more research on that, but that's just a general overview. And then Western and Amish romance takes place in either the Amish country or in uh, the Wild West or on the frontier. So those are very popular genres. To take a look at a couple of examples of these. Nora Roberts is a really good author of contemporary romance. This book right here, Undercurrents, is it's a pretty good example of that. Just to look at the summary real quick to give you an idea. Zane Biglow, I hope I'm not butchering that name. Zane Biglow grew up in a beautiful, perfectly kept house in North Carolina's Blue Ridge Mountains. Strangers and even Zane's own aunt across the lake see his parents as a successful surgeon and his stylish wife, making appearances at their children's ballet recitals and baseball games. Only Zane and his sister know the truth until one brutal night finally reveals cracks of the facade, and Zane escapes for college without a thought of looking back. Years later, Zane returns to his hometown to determined to reconnect with the place and people that meant so much to him despite the painful memories. As he resumes his life in the colorful town, he meets a gifted landscape artist named Darby, who is on the run from ghosts of her own. Together, they will have to teach each other what it means to face the past and stand up for the ones they love. Now, obviously, this isn't too steamy of a novel, but it's a pretty good general example of a contemporary romance, or at least a novel that has contemporary romantic elements. The One True Love of Alice Ann by Eva Marie Everson. Eva Marie is an excellent author and a really great writing coach. She's the founder of Word Weavers International and just an amazing person. This is a really good example of historical romance. It takes place in the 1940s, and it looks at Alice Ann and her journey through having the man she's in love with enlisting in World War, I believe it's World War II. So it's a really good example. Like I say, it can take place, historical romance can take place in anything as recent as the Great Depression, the 60s, World War II, or you could go all the way back to the founding of the country or medieval times, but anything set in a historical setting. But this is a really good book. I encourage you to check it out if you're interested in that genre. Lynette Eason is a great author of romantic suspense. I'm just going to read over the summary of this to give you an idea of romantic suspense and sort of what separates it from the crime thriller genre. Those two can be blended together very well, but romantic suspense often features the main character sort of falling in love with or having a sort of romantic journey with either her partner or another character in the story. Police officer Isabel St. John loves her crazy, loud law enforcement family. With three brothers and two sisters, she's never without someone to hang out with or fight with. And she knows they'll be there for her when things get tough, like when her partner is murdered and she barely escapes with her own life. Determined to discover exactly what happened, Izzy's investigation sends her headfirst into a criminal organization, possibly with cops on the payroll, including someone from her own family. With her dead partner's handsome homicide detective brother Ryan shadowing her every move, Izzy's head is spinning. How can she secure justice for her partner when doing so could mean sending someone she loves to prison? And how will she guard her heart when the man she's had a secret crush on for years won't leave her side? Like I said, Lynette Eason's an excellent author of romantic suspense, and this is a really popular genre today in the market. So if you are interested in that, there's a lot of room for that, a lot of demand for that genre. Now, The Captain's Conquest. This is a friend of mine, Suzanne I pronounced her name Baggins just because I'm a Lord of the Rings fan, and it's a really, really amazing thing that that's her last name. But I believe it's also pronounced Begans. Begans. She was actually on the show a couple of weeks ago. She writes Regency, Gothic Regency, and her book series, the Black Diamond series, is an excellent example of Gothic Regency. It incorporates some mystical elements, and it does take place during that element in historic Great Britain. So it's important when you're trying to decide which genre to set your novel in that you keep in mind the different hallmarks that readers are going to expect going in. A fan of science fiction is going to expect really far out scientific ideas and theories that are set deep in your story. Fans of romantic suspense are going to expect certain romantic elements and really interesting crimes to solve and mysteries to try to unravel. And fans of fantasy are going to expect magical elements, wizards and witches and dragons and sweeping landscapes and really well-defined cultures. So you want to make sure that while you sort of stay true to your story and what your vision is for your book, that you also meet the reader's wants and needs when they go into a genre. And like I say, any good book is going to be a blend of several different genres. Any good story is going to have elements of romance and suspense and intrigue, no matter what genre it's set in. But it's just a matter of striking that balance between being true to yourself and what you want for your story, and also making sure that you give the reader what they want when they go into a certain genre. But be sure to check out the Serious Writer website for more information on the Academy and the different blogs that are available. The next episode of Genre Chat is set to air on, I believe it's November the 20th. We're going to be taking an in-depth look at the writing process of police procedural novels and the different characters that you'll find there. Hopefully we'll be talking to a author of police procedurals and get a really good perspective on what it's like to write a novel in that genre. But thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next week.